Hello everyone! Do you still remember what we've discussed last time? It is romance, one of the popular literature genres. Now, we will be talking about science fiction. Though science fiction often thought of in the same vein as fantasy, what distinguishes science fiction stories is that they lean heavily on themes of technology and future science. You'll find apocalyptic and dystopian novels in the sci-fi genre as well. So what is science fiction? Science fiction, often called sci-fi, is a genre of fiction literature whose content is imaginative but based in science. It relies heavily on scientific facts, theories, and principles as support for its settings, characters, themes, and plot lines, which is what makes it different from fantasy. So while the storyline and elements of science fiction stories are imaginary, they are usually possible according to science, or at least plausible. Although examples of science fiction can be found as far back as the Middle Ages, its presence in literature was not particularly significant until the late 1800s. Its true popularity for both writers and audiences came with the rise of technology over the past 150 years, with developments such as electricity, space exploration, medical advances, industrial growth, and so on. As science and technology progress, so does the genre of science fiction. After defining sci-fi or science fiction, let us move to its other details to be discussed. First, the types of sci-fi. Science fiction is usually distinguished as either hard or soft. Hard science fiction strictly follows scientific facts and principles. It is strongly focused on natural sciences like physics, astronomy, chemistry, astrophysics, and etc. Interestingly, hard science fiction is often written by real scientists and has been known for making both accurate and inaccurate predictions of future events. And soft science fiction, on the other hand, is characterized by a focus on social sciences like anthropology, sociology, psychology, and politics. In other words, sciences involving human behavior. So soft sci-fi stories mainly address the possible scientific consequences of human behavior. In truth, most works use a combination of both hard and soft science fiction. Soft sci-fi allows audiences to connect on an emotional level, and hard sci-fi adds real scientific evidence so that they can imagine the action actually happening. So combining the two is a better storytelling technique because it lets audiences connect with the story on two levels. Science fiction also has a seemingly endless number of subgenres, including but not limited to time travel, apocalyptic, utopian or dystopian, alternate history, space opera, and military science fiction. Many times, science fiction turns real scientific theories into full stories about what is possible and or imaginable. And that is why it is important. Many stories use hard facts and truths of sciences to suggest what could really happen in the future. To explore what could happen if certain events or circumstances came to be, or suggest consequences of technological and scientific advancements and innovation. Historically, it has been a popular form for not only authors but scientists as well. In the past 150 years, science fiction has become a huge genre with a particularly large presence in film and television. In fact, the TV network, Sci-Fi, is completely devoted to science fiction media. It is a particularly fascinating and mind-bending genre for audiences because of its connection to reality. Examples of science fiction in literature are these two. A genre-defining piece of science fiction literature is H.G. Wells' 1898 novel, The War of the Worlds, which tells the story of an alien invasion in the United Kingdom that threatens to destroy mankind. Here, The narrator describes a time when mankind was naive. Next, published in 1949, George Orwell's 1984 shows the future of mankind in a dystopian state. It is set in what is now the United Kingdom, and shows society under tyrannical rule of a government that has their population under constant surveillance and threat of imprisonment for having wrong thoughts. Throughout the novel is the constant theme that Big Brother is watching. This passage describes the story's setting, dull, colorless, and monitored, and hints at society's status. Then 4 examples of science fiction in pop culture are these 2 films. Perhaps the most popular and well-known examples of science fiction in popular culture, specifically space opera science fiction, are George Lucas' legendary Star Wars films. Star Wars has perhaps one of the largest, if not the largest, fan following of all time. And its status in the science fiction world is absolutely epic. Example number 2, The Matrix. It is a sci-fi action film that thrilled audiences upon its release. It tells the story of a world where human existence is completely controlled and life on Earth is actually only a simulation occurring in our minds. This simulation is called The Matrix. If you may ask, what is The Matrix? Here, the protagonist is presented with the information that his life is all an illusion, and it is almost more than his mind can handle. Eventually, he is given the choice of whether to continue to live in the Matrix or to live in reality and try to save mankind. A task that is almost impossible and at times terrifying. There are also related terms that was mentioned earlier, the word fantasy and space opera. Fantasy. Fantasy is a genre of fiction that concentrates on imaginary elements, like the fantastic. This can mean magic, the supernatural, alternate worlds, superheroes, monsters, aliens, and so on. Many science fiction works involve elements of fantasy, like imagined worlds made of beings from other galaxies, paranormal powers, and etc. So the 2 genres tend to overlap. However, the primary distinction is that the elements of fantasy and science fiction always have a basis in science, whereas fantasy is strictly imaginative. Space opera. A space opera is one of the most popular forms of science fiction, where the whole story or majority of the story takes place in outer space. Its name comes from the idea of a television soap opera, but it has nothing to do with a musical opera. Space operas usually feature conflicts in space with beings or societies who have advanced technology or supernatural powers. Usually, space operas are action and adventure themed, featuring space travel, interstellar wars, or heroes trying to save the universe, like Star Wars, the film. Ma'am, how to use science fiction? Class, science fiction is a very broad genre. In fact, it is often described as difficult to define but easily identifiable. In other words, many scholars say you know it when you see it. Accordingly, there are very few rules or restrictions when writing within the genre, but its stories always have certain key elements and themes that immediately reveal them as science fiction. Here are some of the primary traits of science fiction works. Set in space, or an altered version of Earth, set in a time in the future or within some sort of alternate timeline outside our own. Existence of and travel between alternate universes, galaxies, planets, dimensions, etc. Characters like aliens, robots, cyborgs, mutants, or intelligent computers with and without human intelligence and their conflicts and or coexistence with humans. characters with paranormal abilities that can be either helpful or hindering. Time travel, or other means of travel that are beyond what is physically possible, like traveling at the speed of light, teleportation, etc. Advanced, futuristic technologies, those that are beyond what we are capable today, that are part of normal life. Political systems that were developed after an apocalypse or as a result of mankind's downfall. Technologies that threaten to wipe out mankind, for example, are the biological warfare, industrial war, elimination of natural resources, and etc. Of all of traits mentioned or posted on screen, perhaps the most significant aspect of science fiction is the setting. Science fiction settings are often somewhat beyond the audience's typical imagination, but are supported by scientific explanations. They provide the majority of the tone and feeling for the theory and help the audience to step outside of their normal scope of understanding and open their minds to new worlds, times, and possibilities through science. How about when to use science fiction? As exemplified by its own name, science fiction is always fiction. So, an account of a historical event that was heavily reliant on science, for example, the landing on the moon, is non-fiction. But a story about landing on the moon and discovering man-alien race would be science fiction. Therefore, science fiction is used when an author wants to use real scientific theories, ideas, or facts to explore possibilities and create fictional scenarios. Though it is a very strong genre on its own, many science fiction stories use elements of other genres of fiction like horror, adventure, mystery, thriller, superhero fiction, and even comedy. All in all, science fiction based on Ursula K. Le Guin is not prescriptive. It is descriptive. Sci-fi does not prescribe how a word should be. Instead, it must be one that attempts to describe how a word is. I am Jana Denise Domingo, and that's all for today. Thank you.